She was hired to serve champagne, not survive humiliation. But one careless moment in a rich girl's temper turned her into the centerpiece of a wedding meant to forget her. The estate glimmered like a crown set upon the brow of a hill, each polished window pane catching the early morning sun like cut crystal. From the base of the winding drive to the highest spire of the turreted mansion, the grounds thrummed with anticipation. White roses dripped from wrought iron arches, string quartets rehearsed near the terrace. Gardeners trimmed already perfect hedges as if perfection demanded a second pass. And beneath all the gilded layers of luxury, a nervous current hummed. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the wedding. Inside the mansion, beneath chandeliers imported from Venice and ceilings hand-painted by forgotten artists, a small army bustled to meet the clock's silent demands. The staff moved like clockwork, though none could deny that today's pressure weighed heavier than usual. Everyone knew who she was, the bride. Charlotte Kingsley, heiress to the Kingsley textile fortune, socialite turned influencer turned regional royalty. She walked with the air of someone who believed wealth came not from birth but from divine favor, as if God himself had signed off on her lineage. Downstairs in the servants' hallway, Maya moved with quiet precision. Her uniform was crisp, though it was the fourth time she'd worn it this week. Her shoes pinched slightly, she had grown too used to hand-me-downs that never quite fit. Maya kept her head low, and her thoughts tucked tightly behind her tired eyes. She'd taken the job a month ago after her mother's third hospital admission. The bills were piling up, and food alone had started to become an equation of trade-offs. So, when the staffing agency mentioned a one-day wedding gig at the Kingsley estate with double pay, she didn't hesitate. The morning had already thrown her two spilled trays, a near miss with a champagne cart, and an irritable florist who barked instructions like insults. But Maya bore it all with that strange mixture of pride and silence that working-class black women carried like armor. She'd been raised on two codes: work twice as hard and leave no trace. That meant no attitude. No mistakes, no eyes meeting eyes. She rounded a corner near the marble grand staircase, careful to avoid the path of the incoming stylists. A guest asked her for a napkin, then didn't say thank you. Another gestured toward a potted plant as if she were invisible. She had seen the pattern before in boutiques, at her old retail job, even once at school when a teacher had assumed she couldn't be in the honors class. Here, at this estate, it was simply louder, more concentrated. Here, she was something to step over on the way to elegance. Above her, in the bridal suite, Charlotte laughed. It was a brittle, champagne-tinted sound. Someone handed her pearls that had once belonged to a duchess. She scoffed at how vintage smelled and ordered a second glass of mimosas. Her bridesmaids hovered, all air kisses and false sweetness. None noticed the way Charlotte's lips tightened when things weren't exactly as she'd envisioned. This wasn't just her wedding, it was her coronation. And downstairs, Maya reached into her apron for a pair of gloves and exhaled. Just a few more hours, she told herself. Just smile and survive. The castle on the hill wasn't made for girls like her, but even in its shadow she refused to shrink. The morning sun spilled through the cathedral-like windows of the west wing as a sleek black car rolled up the long driveway, tires whispering against cobblestone. The driver stepped out briskly to open the door, and from the quiet interior emerged a man whose presence immediately slowed the motion around him. He wasn't tall in the way that demanded attention, nor dressed to shout his wealth. But he carried himself with an ease that unsettled the staff trained to bow to arrogance. Daniel Mercer, the groom. A name printed in gold foil on every invitation and whispered behind every champagne flute for the past 6 months. Few people knew where Daniel came from. He was a mystery even among the high society circles. Charlotte moved in like a queen in her court. No family crest, no lineage traced back to shipping tycoons or oil barons. Rumors claimed he'd made his own money tech startup, maybe? Or real estate? Others whispered more cynically that he was a social climber with a smooth tongue and a handsome face. But those who met him found the theories lacking. Daniel Mercer didn't wear ambition like armor. He wore it like a secret. He stepped into the mansion and nodded graciously to the coordinator scrambling his way. "Right on time, Mr. Mercer," the man said, half bowing, half sweating. Daniel offered a warm smile. "Please, just Daniel. No need for ceremony." He walked slowly through the foyer, letting his eyes drift up the gilded staircase and along the arched ceilings. The place felt like a cathedral built to worship wealth. Opulence for opulence's sake. It didn't move him not in the way it clearly did the guests who had been arriving since sunrise. A cluster of bridesmaids passed by, perfume trailing like contrails. One of them giggled and whispered something behind a manicured hand. Daniel heard the words anyway. God, he's even hotter in person. He offered a brief smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His attention was elsewhere. In the corner of the hallway, near a linen cart, Maya bent over, adjusting a silver tray that threatened to tip over. A waiter had knocked it earlier and walked away, without so much as a backward glance. Daniel paused. His gaze lingered for just a moment, long enough to see her hands tremble slightly as she steadied the contents, the pressed precision of her uniform, the quiet way she fixed what others broke. Their eyes met for less than a breath. Maya, startled, stood upright. For the briefest second, her guard slipped. He gave a small nod, polite, human, and continued walking. But something passed between them, recognition maybe, or the rare wordless acknowledgement between two people who have known struggle, even if from different angles. Behind him, whispers resumed. Why had he stopped? Who was that girl? Was he nervous? No, Daniel Mercer wasn't nervous. But he was thinking. He'd spent the last few weeks listening, truly listening to the way Charlotte spoke to her stylists, to the staff at tastings, to strangers who didn't own last names made for headlines. He had noticed the patterns, the subtle cruelty, the tight smiles when the cameras were off. He hadn't said anything, not yet. But as he walked deeper into the house that Charlotte's father had built to intimidate, Daniel felt the weight of decision begin to settle on his shoulders. Today would be more than a wedding. It would be a reckoning. The bridal suite was a world unto itself, flushed with soft pinks, glittering with cut glass, and dense with perfume that clung to the air like mist. Silk robes fluttered, laughter rippled like champagne fizz. The room was a storm of femininity, wealth, and carefully curated chaos. Beneath the laughter, however, pulsed a low, quiet tension, something artificial, in the way the bridesmaids smiled too wide, sipped too fast, and avoided Charlotte's eyes when she spoke. Charlotte Kingsley stood in front of a three-paneled mirror, draped in the skeletal elegance of white lace. The dress shimmered with hand-sewn crystals imported from Milan, its train spilling behind her like frost. She didn't smile as she examined herself. Not fully. Her lips curled only slightly, less admiration, more assessment. She didn't see a bride. She saw an empire, a triumph of branding, of legacy. Today was her ascension, and everything had to be flawless. I look too soft in this light, she murmured. Dim it. And move the orchids. They're crooked. One of her bridesmaids moved quickly to obey. Another glanced toward the door as it opened gently. Maya stepped in, careful not to let the door creak behind her. She held a velvet-lined tray with a necklace, a vintage diamond choker that Charlotte had demanded at the last second. Maya had walked 3 city blocks to retrieve it from a private courier only an hour ago, soaked in sweat beneath her uniform, careful not to even breathe on the priceless stones. Now, standing at the threshold, she clutched the tray with both hands, head slightly bowed. Miss Kingsley, your necklace, she said softly. Charlotte turned, lips parting with faint distaste as she took in the maid's flushed face and damp collar. Her eyes moved over Maya like she was cataloging a smudge on the wall. Finally, Charlotte said, taking the necklace but not thanking her. God, you look exhausted. Try not to breathe on my dress. A few bridesmaids tittered nervously, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Maya swallowed. Apologies, ma'am. Charlotte stepped closer, tilting her chin upward as she admired herself in the mirror again. You know, she said, her voice now coated in sugar, it always amazes me how some people are just born for the background. Don't you think? Like your whole life is just spent blending in. It's almost an art. Maya blinked, holding her breath. Her fingers dug into the edge of the tray. 1,000 retorts bloomed and died behind her lips. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said again, this time steadier. Is there anything else? Charlotte didn't respond right away. She turned to her bridesmaids and grinned like a child who had found a toy to break. I mean, honestly, this is why I keep telling Daddy we need better agencies. Some of these girls barely know how to speak. The laughter returned, louder now, emboldened by Charlotte's cruelty. Maya lowered her eyes. The tray still hovered between her hands like a shield. She said nothing. A moment passed, and then Charlotte waved a manicured hand. You can go, but quietly, please. You're clashing with the vibe. Maya left the room, her back straight, her heart hammering. Inside, Charlotte admired her reflection again, tilting her head. Perfect, she whispered to herself. But in the hallway beyond the door, Maya stood still, her breath catching, her jaw clenched. Somewhere behind her, a quartet had begun tuning their strings. And somewhere ahead, something deeper than lace and loathing was beginning to unravel. The hall outside the bridal suite was thick with footsteps and floral perfume, a blur of motion as staff weaved between guests, decorators, and the mounting pressure of the countdown. Maya moved briskly, hands full with a stack of white napkins she'd been summoned to deliver to the reception tent. Her cheeks were still hot, her mind replaying Charlotte's words like a wound that refused to close. But she kept walking, kept breathing. The tray was gone, the necklace delivered, only a few more hours. Ahead, a bridesmaid exited the suite with a mimosa in one hand and a curling iron in the other, nearly colliding with a server. Maya swerved to avoid the chaos, narrowly sidestepping a falling garment bag. The hallway had become a gauntlet of silk and tension. And then it happened. As Maya turned the corner near the grand staircase, she collided lightly, but just enough with Charlotte. The bride had stepped out of the suite in her full gown, her gloved fingers curled delicately around a glass of champagne. The impact was slight, barely more than a touch, but the crystal flute slipped from Charlotte's hand, arced through the air, and shattered at their feet. A splash of champagne dotted the lace at her hip. The golden liquid beaded on the bodice like tears. A breathless silence fell. Maya froze, horror rising up through her throat like smoke. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, immediately stepping back, arms raised slightly in apology. Charlotte looked down at her gown, then at the broken glass, then up at Maya. It was not anger in her eyes. It was contempt. Cold, sharp, performed for an audience. "You ignorant little—" Charlotte's voice dropped to a hiss, but she made sure those nearby could still hear. She raised her hand without hesitation and, before Maya could blink, struck her hard across the face. The sound cracked through the hallway. Not loud, but intimate, brutal. Maya staggered a step back, one hand flying to her cheek. Her breath caught. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with the effort of holding them back. Gasps erupted from the corridor. A bridesmaid covered her mouth. The wedding planner took a cautious step forward but didn't speak. No one did. No one moved. Charlotte, still panting, straightened her spine like a statue reset on its pedestal. "You just ruined a $40,000 dress," she sneered. Of course it would be you." Maya's fingers curled at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize again. She simply stood there, face burning, eyes locked on a spot somewhere beyond Charlotte's head, not in defiance. In survival. The planner finally stepped in, his voice brittle with panic. "Miss Kingsley, we can get that cleaned, there's still time." Charlotte ignored him. She turned away, lifting her train so it wouldn't brush against Maya's uniform. "I want her gone," she said flatly, "before the ceremony." Maya's lips parted to speak, but no sound came. She looked around at the facillant, pale, complicitant, realized she was utterly alone. The bride disappeared into the suite again, flanked by whispering women. The shattered glass remained, a constellation of guilt no one would clean up just yet. And Maya, still trembling, bent to pick up the first shard. The ballroom corridor still pulsed with the aftershock of glass breaking and the echo of Charlotte's raised hand. The air had turned static, charged with unspoken judgment, yet no one dared speak it aloud. Maya knelt quietly by the spill, her fingers trembling as she gathered the fragments of the broken flute, the sting of the slap still burning on her cheek. She didn't cry. Crying would give Charlotte something. And Maya had already given her too much. Across the hall, servers paused mid-step, glancing sidelong before quickly moving on. A bridesmaid lingered for half a moment longer than she should have, then turned her face away. It was easier, somehow, to pretend Maya wasn't there. Easier to believe the violence had been an accident, a reaction. Not something deliberate, not something rehearsed. Charlotte emerged once more, now flanked by her stylist and wedding coordinator. Her gown had been hastily blotted, though a faint golden smear of champagne still darkened the lace near her waist. Her jaw was tight, her eyes scanning the hallway as if searching for something to erase. She spotted Maya still crouched at the floor, a piece of glass held delicately between her fingers like a promise she never made. "You're still here?" Charlotte's voice was sharp now, no longer performative. I said I wanted her gone. Maya stood slowly, brushing her hands against her apron. Her face was neutral, but her chest rose and fell with measured breath. I was cleaning it up, she said, her voice even, though her throat ached with swallowed pain. Charlotte narrowed her eyes and took a step closer, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. You know what your problem is? She said, loud enough now for others to hear. You think dignity is something you're entitled to. That just because you work hard, smile politely, and keep your head down, someone like me should treat you like an equal. Maya didn't move, didn't flinch. And when you forget your place, Charlotte added, the world reminds you. Then, with the cool detachment of someone brushing lint off silk, Charlotte raised her hand again. This time, the slap came not in secret, not in a hushed moment behind closed doors, but out in the open, in front of waiters, florists, decorators, and distant guests peeking in through the entry arch. It landed with a cruel precision across Maya's other cheek. The sound rang out again, but this time it echoed longer, like something had finally cracked, not just glass, not just silence, but the facade itself. Maya staggered back, catching herself against the wall. She didn't fall. She stood upright, her chin lifting ever so slightly, not in defiance, but in the raw resolve of someone who had nothing left to fear. Gasps erupted again, louder this time. The wedding coordinator's mouth opened, then shut. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." A distant camera flashed. The cruelty had become spectacle. I want her out of here, Charlotte barked. Now. And then quiet footsteps. Not frantic, not rushed. Just deliberate. From the far end of the hallway, Daniel Mercer walked into view. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't confused, he wasn't smiling. He had seen enough. Daniel's steps echoed like thunder swallowed in velvet, soft but heavy with meaning. The hallway cleared as he approached. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter thinned to silence. Eyes shifted from Charlotte's flushed face to Maya's trembling form, and then to the groom himself, immaculate in a tailored gray suit, his tie undone as if he'd peeled back the ceremony to show the man beneath. He stopped just short of the shattered glass, just short of Maya, who stood tall despite the crimson rising across her cheek. His eyes were on her, not in pity but in focus, like she was the only person in the room that mattered. "What happened?" he asked, voice quiet but impossible to ignore. No one answered. Charlotte, still clutching her skirt, scoffed with a kind of performative weariness. "She bumped into me," she said, flipping her hand as if brushing away a speck of dust. "Ruined my dress." And then stood there like nothing happened. Daniel didn't look at her. "Did you hit her?" he asked, not accusatory, just confirming. Charlotte tilted her chin. "She was careless. This is my wedding day, Daniel." He nodded slowly. "You hit her twice?" Charlotte laughed, short and breathless. "Are we really doing this? Are you seriously taking her side over mine right now?" Still, he didn't look at her. His gaze returned to Maya, who stood there with her back to the wall and the broken glass at her feet, her hand still trembling slightly though she tried to hide it. She met his eyes. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out the ring box. It was small, velvet, blood black. Every pair of eyes in the corridor locked onto it. Charlotte stepped forward, her tone faltering. "Daniel, come on, don't do this. It's just a misunderstanding. She was..." He opened the box. Inside lay the Ringa flawless vintage solitaire framed in a platinum setting. Cold, immaculate, lifeless. Daniel looked at it for a moment as if trying to remember what it was supposed to mean. Then he looked at Charlotte for the first time. "I saw the way you treated the caterer last week," he said quietly, "and the way you spoke to the valet, and the florist who got the flower color wrong. I told myself it was stress. I told myself you didn't mean it." He turned the box over in his hand slowly, deliberately. "But this," he nodded toward Maya without turning, "this was you, unfiltered, proud of your cruelty." Charlotte's voice cracked. "I was upset. You weren't here. And Shesh walked right into me like..." Daniel snapped the box shut. "I would rather call off this wedding," he said, voice low, "than bind myself to someone who thinks grace is weakness and status gives you permission to humiliate." He stepped forward and placed the closed ring box gently on a nearby console table. "She's not the one who embarrassed you today," he added, his eyes burning into Charlotte. "You did." He turned back toward Maya, offering her his hand not as a gesture of ownership, but of apology, of solidarity. Behind them, the silence split open as guests whispered, as the moment shattered like the champagne glass on the floor. Charlotte stood frozen in her dress of lace and silk and pride, watching the man she believed she had won walk away from the altar long before the aisle. The ceremony had already begun outside, under the arched canopy of imported roses and rented heaven. Rows of white chairs were lined with guests dressed in pastel elegance, fanning themselves with silk programs, murmuring behind sunglasses. A string quartet played Vivaldi beneath an oak tree strung with fairy lights. They played for no one now. They played because they were paid to. Charlotte stood in the bridal suite alone, breath shallow, fists clenched at her sides. Her makeup was perfect, more perfect than ever, but something in her eyes had cracked. The stylist hovered by the mirror, unsure whether to speak. No one dared ask where Daniel had gone. No one knew he had already made his decision. Downstairs, Maya sat in the kitchen on a wooden stool, surrounded by silence, a cold cloth pressed against her cheek. Her apron was streaked with champagne and shame, but she held it together like glass just before it breaks. The head caterer had offered her a ride home. Another staff member had gently suggested she sue. Maya said nothing. She just kept her eyes on the clock. Then the door opened. Daniel stepped in. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood across from her, hands in his pockets, and watched her like someone seeing daylight after being buried too long in gold. "I came to say thank you," he said finally. Maya blinked. "For what?" "For not shrinking." She started to reply, but he held up a hand. "I don't want to put you in the middle of this, but today woke me up." He glanced down at the floor, as if ashamed. I ignored what I saw. I told myself she'd change, that she'd soften, that maybe my love would refine her somehow. But that's not how cruelty works. It doesn't bend. It only breaks. He stepped forward and gently placed something on the counter beside her, a folded piece of paper, the vows he had written last night. "I was supposed to read these to Charlotte," he said, his voice quieter now, "but they never really belonged to her." He looked at Maya again, truly looked and nodded. Then he left as quietly as he came. Out in the garden, the guests began to murmur louder. The groom had still not arrived. Charlotte appeared minutes later, her face pale, her smile painted on with desperation. She walked down the aisle to the sound of unsure strings and forced applause. Every step was a gamble. Every eye felt like a question. She reached the altar. The officiant cleared his throat. But Daniel wasn't there. The crowd turned as he appeared not in the tuxedo they expected, but in a dark shirt and slacks, no tie, no pretense. He walked slowly to the front, past the photographers lowering their lenses, past the mother of the bride's audible gasp, past Charlotte's shaking lips. He took the mic from the officiant. "I was going to marry someone today," he said, his voice calm, measured, amplified by truth. "But marriage without dignity is just theater. And I've seen enough make-believe to last a lifetime." Gasps rippled. Whispers turned to chatter. A few stood. A few sat lower in their seats. Daniel turned to Charlotte one final time. "I don't need a partner who makes me look good," he said. "I need one who is good." And then he turned away, leaving behind the aisle, the ring, the applause, and the story Charlotte tried to script. As he walked out of the ceremony, the wind lifted the edge of the canopy, and for the first time that day, the sun shone without permission. The tabloids would later call it the wedding walkout heard round the county, but what happened next was not chaos. It was revelation. Daniel didn't run. He didn't storm. He walked slowly, deliberately through rows of stunned guests who parted for him like scripture. Some stood in protest, others in reverent silence. A few still clung to their programs as if the weight of paper could hold the moment together. Charlotte remained at the altar, veil half slipped from her head, mouth parted in disbelief. Her mother hissed something at her from the front row, but she didn't move, couldn't. The image she'd constructed of herself bride, beauty, heiress was unraveling like the hem of a dress caught in the wind. She had lost the one thing she hadn't bought: control. Daniel reached the stone courtyard just outside the ceremony and turned to face the guests who had followed him out, their curiosity outweighing their manners. A few cameras were already raised. Phones clicked like insects in the heat. He didn't flinch. "I suppose you all deserve an explanation," he said, voice steady as wind through pine. A hush fell again. Daniel glanced toward the estate behind him, the marble, the chandeliers, the columns built to impress. "You all know Charlotte Kingsley," he began. "You know the family, the money, the legacy." A few chuckles nervous, uncertain rose and fell. "But you don't know me," he continued. "Not really." He paused. "I was raised by a woman named Elise Mercer. She was a cleaning lady, a single mother. Worked 16-hour shifts so I could go to a public school in a neighborhood where textbooks still had covers. We didn't have much, just each other. And dignity." His gaze sharpened. "I watched her scrub the homes of women like Charlotte. Women who didn't say thank you, who left messes on purpose, who believed kindness was a decoration to wear when guests were watching." He stepped forward, letting his voice resonate in anger, but in clarity. "I built my life trying to be the opposite of what she endured. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask myself whether the woman I loved would treat my mother with respect, or like a shadow in her home." Silence. Daniel scanned the crowd. "This morning I saw Maya, a young woman working herself to the bone just to get through the day, humiliated, slapped, dehumanized." He looked back at the wedding arch behind him, now hanging limp in the breeze. "I realized I was about to spend forever with someone who thought that kind of cruelty was justified by inconvenience." He folded the speech he had once planned to give and slid it into his pocket like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to him. "I'm not ashamed to walk away from a $1,000 cake or a diamond ring," he said, "but I would be ashamed to walk away from my values." And with that, he walked. Not away from a wedding, but towards something greater. The truth. The crowd didn't cheer, it didn't boo. It simply watched, stunned, as the man they thought they knew became someone worth knowing. And Charlotte, still standing beneath the arch alone, realized too late that the vows she had waited her whole life to hear had just been rewritten without her in them. The sky had turned the color of bruised lilacs, and the string quartet had long since fallen silent. The aisle Charlotte once envisioned as her golden path to social immortality now lay before her like a discarded stage. Petals were trampled, chairs sat askew, and the bride the woman meant to be radiant and adored stood, frozen beneath the floral arch, her veil half torn, mascara holding on by threads. Alone. Daniel didn't look back. He walked through the gravel courtyard, past manicured hedges and carefully positioned lighting rigs, past photographers whispering into their headsets and guests, pretending not to be thrilled by the scandal. Each step was deliberate, final. There was no anger in his stride, only clarity, the kind that comes when the illusion shatters and something solid is finally uncovered beneath it. Behind him, Charlotte's voice rang out. "Daniel, wait." He paused, just once. She hurried after him, the hem of her gown catching under her heels, forcing her to stumble. She was breathless, her voice pitched with desperation now, not pride. "This is insane," she hissed. "You're making a mistake. This is just some stupid moment. You're going to throw everything away over her?" Daniel turned. But the man who faced her now wasn't the man she'd been planning to marry. Not the quiet, agreeable figure who complimented her hair and paid for spa days without protest. No, this man's silence had become thunder. "It's not just a moment, Charlotte," he said. "It's you. You didn't just slap a maid. You exposed everything you really are when you think no one important is watching." Charlotte's face twisted, an ugly mixture of panic and entitlement. She was out of line. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For existing near you?" She hesitated, realizing too late there was no defense worth saying out loud. "I wanted to believe there was something real between us," Daniel continued. "But you've spent your whole life thinking love is a prize you win by being admired. It's not. It's a promise. And I won't break it by giving it to someone who treats people like they're beneath her." Charlotte stepped back as if struck. For the first time, her silence wasn't strategic. It was stunned. He looked at her wedding gown, the diamonds clinging to her neck like gilt. "You think I humiliated you?" Daniel said. "Number, you did that all on your own." And with that, he turned again, and this time, he didn't stop. He passed the reception tent where servers whispered behind tray-laden hands. He passed rows of uncut cake and champagne that would never be poured. He passed white roses meant to symbolize purity and saw only artifice. And then, beyond the courtyard, he saw her. Maya stood at the edge of the staff lot, her coat folded over one arm, her uniform slightly stained, her face still solemn but composed. She hadn't planned to say goodbye. She didn't even know he'd look for her. But he did. Their eyes met. Maya blinked in disbelief as Daniel approached, the chaos of the mansion falling away behind him like a story no longer worth telling. She opened her mouth, but he shook his head. "You don't need to say anything," he said gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered anyway. He nodded. "I know." Then, in front of the remaining few staff members watching from a distance, Daniel Mercer did what no one expected. He stood beside the woman who had been struck down and offered her something rarer than diamonds or dynasty. Dignity, decency, and something like beginning. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches above the staff parking lot, where the shadows of the castle no longer reached. Maya stood beneath a weathered maple tree, the late afternoon light filtering through the leaves in gold and amber. Her cheeks were still warm from everything that had unfolded, but the sting had faded. What remained was harder to name, some combination of weariness and wonder, as if the ground beneath her had shifted but she was still upright. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his eyes soft but steady. He didn't speak at first. Neither did she. The silence wasn't heavy. It was respectful. It allowed the moment to breathe. "Most men in your position," Maya finally said, her voice quiet but strong, "would have let it happen, would have ignored it, married her anyway, told themselves it wasn't their fight." Daniel turned his gaze toward the towering house in the distance. "I almost did," he admitted. "That's the worst part. I saw signs, but I didn't want to believe them. I told myself love could fix it, or that I could, but love without conscience?" He shook his head. "That's not love. That's surrender in a tuxedo." Maya looked at him then, not the groom, not the man who had walked away from everything, but the human being beneath all of it. There was no smugness in his expression, no ego, just resolve. He wasn't saving her. He wasn't performing. He was simply standing with her. "You didn't have to say anything," Maya said. "But you did, and people saw. That matters." Daniel gave a half smile. "I didn't do it so people would see. I did it because I saw you." Her breath caught not from romance, not from any promise of something more, but from the rawness of being recognized, of being seen not as furniture in someone else's narrative, but as human. The catering van pulled up nearby. The driver leaned out the window and called, "We're heading out, Maya. You coming?" She hesitated. Daniel glanced at the van, then back to her. "Can I offer you a ride instead?" Maya studied him. She thought about her mother, her overdue bills, the years she'd spent swallowing her voice just to survive. And then she made a decision, not one made in weakness or gratitude, but in strength. "Sure," she said, "but I'm not sitting up front like some kind of charity case." Daniel's eyes crinkled. "Fair enough. I wouldn't have offered if I thought you were." They walked to his car in silence, side by side, as the sounds of the broken wedding behind them faded into memory. Guests were leaving. Gossip would spiral. The Kingsleys would retreat behind PR teams in silence. But none of that mattered here. What mattered was this. Maya didn't leave that estate in shame. She didn't slink away, reduced or erased. She walked away with her head high, her dignity intact, and the knowledge that someone, finally, had chosen decency over spectacle. And Daniel? He didn't leave with a bride. He left with his soul. And sometimes, that's the better vow. By Monday morning, the internet had done what it always does. It transformed a private humiliation into a public reckoning. Clips from the wedding had surfaced online, grainy at first shaky cell phone footage from a guest who never intended to become a whistleblower. But what started as whispers in private group chats quickly bloomed into headlines. "Heiress slaps maid at lavish wedding groom walks out at altar." Hashtags multiplied. Screenshots of Charlotte's social media, once filled with glowing praise and curated elegance, were now flooded with outrage and disbelief. News anchors speculated, podcasts dissected. Influencers posted reaction videos with expressions of performative shock. But beneath the online theater, something real stirred. For every sensationalist take, there were thousands of comments from women who had served champagne to sneering faces, from working-class daughters raised on grit and grace, from people who saw in Maya not just a maid but themselves. Charlotte Kingsley's team issued a statement within 48 hours. It was polished, impersonal, and late. It claimed miscommunication and deep regret, and included a grainy photo of Charlotte shaking hands with a charity executive. It fooled no one. The world had seen too much. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer vanished from public view. He gave no interviews, declined every morning show invitation. He didn't need to defend himself. His actions had already spoken in full sentences. Maya, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. At first, she didn't even know what had happened online. Her phone buzzed so often she thought it was broken. Texts poured in from numbers she hadn't seen in years-old classmates, coworkers, even a high school teacher who said she'd watched the clip 3 times and cried each time. Maya didn't know what to say. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to survive. And yet, something was changing. A local news crew reached out. She said no. Then a woman from a nonprofit messaged her not for a story, but with a question. Would you be interested in starting something with us? Maybe a grant? A small business fund for women in service work? At first, Maya hesitated. She didn't want to be a symbol, but the idea sat with her like a seed. A week later, a GoFundMe set up anonymously, though she was certain it was Daniel topped 6 figures. The caption read simply, "For the girl who didn't bow." Maya took none of it for granted. She used what she needed to pay her mother's hospital bills. The rest, she folded into something bigger. She signed a lease for a storefront downtown, small, sunlit, nestled between a bookstore and a bakery. She named it Grace and Grit. It wasn't just a cafe. It was a gathering place, a space for women like her, a space where no one would ever be spoken down to for wearing a uniform, for working a double shift, for not being born into silk and glass. After the storm, Maya found calm not in silence, but in purpose. And though she never spoke publicly of the wedding again, she kept one thing from that day, the folded piece of paper Daniel had handed her in the kitchen, his vows. She never opened it. Some things she figured were truest when left unspoken. The ribbon was a simple 1-0 gold foil, no oversized bow, just a strip of navy blue silk tied between the door handles of Grace and Grit. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Friends, neighbors, and strangers who had followed Maya's story, not because it had gone viral, but because something in it had felt true. There were no photographers, no PR handlers, just a community breathing new life into a space born from the ashes of someone else's performance. Maya stood at the threshold, a pair of silver scissors in her hand. Her apron was spotless this time, not because she was proving something, but because this place, this dream, deserved to begin clean. Her mother sat on a bench nearby, smiling softly beneath her sun hat, a wrapped scarf around her shoulders despite the July warmth. She'd made it through the worst of the hospital visits. And now she was here to see the best. Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows onto fresh countertops and hand-built shelves lined with local goods. Coffee machines hummed in the back, and on the wall, written in delicate script, was the cafe's motto, "Kindness is not earned, it is owed." Maya took a breath, then cut the ribbon. The crowd clapped, children squealed, and for a moment, time stilled, not in tension, not in grief, but in joy, pure and quiet. Hours later, after the first rush of customers had come and gone, Maya found herself behind the counter restocking mugs when the door chimed softly. She looked up, and there he was. Daniel stood in the entrance, dressed simply in jeans and a button-down, a bouquet of wildflowers and hand sunflowers, lilacs, and something purple she couldn't name. "I heard the coffee here is overpriced," he said, a crooked smile on his face. She smirked, wiping her hands on a towel. "Depends on who's asking." He stepped forward, slower this time. No audience, no tension. Just the weight of the months between them, and the soft possibility of something new. "I didn't want to make today about me," he said, "but I wanted to be here. You built this." She nodded, accepting the flowers, brushing her fingers against the stems, with help. "You didn't need me," he said gently. "No," she replied, setting the bouquet in a vase behind the counter. "But I'm glad you showed up." They sat at the corner table, the one closest to the window. For a while they talked, not about the wedding, not about Charlotte. Just about books and music and Maya's plan to add a reading room upstairs for working mothers. About Daniel's new job mentoring inner-city youth through a quiet non-profit, no press, no noise. By the time the sun dipped low, casting amber light across the floorboards, Maya looked at him and saw not the man who'd walked away from a bride, but the man who had walked toward truth. He didn't ask for a second chance, and she didn't offer one. They simply began again. Not as a rescue, not as a headline, but as two people who, by choosing dignity over performance, had found the rarest thing of all, A beginning unburdened by shame. A love not born in spectacle, but in stillness. A new chapter. And this time, the story was entirely theirs.